When I arrived in Winnipeg in the early 70s, coming from a small village just outside of St. John's, Newfoundland, I thought I'd landed in movie heaven. There were almost a dozen theatres within walking distance of my room in the Wolseley area, each with its own distinct architecture and ambience. Shows changed frequently, and I would see 4 or 5 different movies every week. Within a few years, the scene began to change. The first multiplex arrived in the form of 7 shoebox-sized screening rooms at Eaton Place. Then the Town 8 was built at the corner of Notre Dame and Princess. The Garrick and the Capitol added extra screens, but gradually the downtown theatres began to close. By the end of the 80s, Winnipeg moviegoers, like those in most cities, were largely limited to a choice of suburban multiplexes. When I learned that the old Metropolitan building was finally going to be saved from 2 decades of neglect and decay, though unfortunately not as a movie theatre, I began to think about the nature of the experience which had disappeared with all those lost theatres. I wondered whether there were other people who missed them as much as I do. I quickly found out that I wasn't alone, as I met people like Ole Alto, who recalled spending all day at the movies on Saturdays in the late 30s and early 40s, Jean Morton and her brother Andrew Ostrander, whose father managed the legendary Uptown Theater on Academy Road, Dave Verdnick, who at 12 kept an obsessive record of every movie that played in every theater in the city, Reuben Hellman, who grew up in the North End a couple of blocks from the Palace Theater and whose first job out of school was in the Warner Brothers office on Film Exchange Row on Colony Street. I met with and spoke to dozens of people eager to share warm and passionate memories of going to the movies from the 30s through the 80s. People whose families owned theaters, people who worked in theaters themselves, and people who, like me, just loved sitting in the magical dark, absorbed by the fantasies playing up there on the big screen.
Winnipeg had a lot of theaters. Every neighborhood pretty well had their theater. It was a different era. It was a different time. There was color, there was character. It smelled different, you know? It appeased all your senses, your imagination.
My dad came to Winnipeg in the 40s as a teenager. He'd moved in from little town Binscarth, Manitoba, and that was all he did, he said, was he went to a movie every day.
The theaters were packed for the Saturday matinees. I don't know where all the kids came from, but certainly wasn't a big moneymaker. They didn't kick you out at the end. You could stay if you wanted for the longest time.
It was wonderful. It was, getting out of reality and getting into a make-believe world, which is what movies are.
What I didn't realize back in the 70s, when there didn't seem to be enough time to see all the movies that came through Winnipeg, was that the city's theatres were already in decline. In their heyday in the 30s and 40s, there were almost 50 theatres running in the city. Along with the downtown palaces, every neighbourhood had its own theatre or two, and everybody seemed to live within walking distance of the show.
It was a Saturday ritual back in maybe 1935 to 1940. I was about 8 until 13 or so. I lived on Elgin Avenue, about 5 blocks from Main Street, and every Saturday morning, my chums and I, we would always meet out on the street and walk down Elgin Avenue to Ross Avenue. We'd cross the tracks and we'd get to Logan Avenue. About 2 blocks from Main Street, there were a bunch of trees on this vacant lot, and every Saturday morning, about 9 o'clock or thereabouts, we'd be playing in the Tarzan trees. We didn't have watches, but something would say, hey, we better move, we've played enough, and we'd go down to Main Street and we'd start at the Regent Theater because it was 5 cents until 10 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock, it went up to 10 cents to get in. Sometimes the movie had already started. It didn't matter. We didn't have to be there for the start of anything. We'd just get in there and start to enjoy the movie.
I grew up in the North End, and the two theaters I was allowed to go to that were close enough to home was the Times and the Palace. So I'd look every Saturday to see who had the thing I wanted to see. I went by myself. I think some of it for me was an escape. I think I kind of could live in the movies, even though I didn't have a horrible life, but my parents were not very cultured or educated. And I think that gave me a lot of extra things about life and so on, even though, I mean, I knew that things were not real. However, it gave me some more insights.
I was only probably 2 blocks away from the Palace Theater, which is the one we went to, and I always had a bag of sandwiches with me and a bottle of pop, so I don't starve to death for the few hours that I spent upstairs in the theater. Usually from 12 noon until your mother or your father came to get you out of there about 5:30, 5:45. My mother made me salami sandwiches, and the pop was a bottle of winola. That was a 12-ounce bottle made by the Boroditsky family on Selkirk Avenue. And you could smell, the second floor always had the smell of garlic or onions. So you knew the people that were up there were basically European. When you went to the theater, it was 5 cents. And you would get a comic book with the top half torn off, which I'm assuming was those that came back from the stores that couldn't sell them. They would give them to you at no charge. But that's what you got for 5 cents.
We had no idea what was playing, except perhaps maybe the serials. Cowboys and Indians was the theme at that time, and they'd start off and they'd give you maybe a 10 or 15 minutes of this movie, and it'd end up hanging on a cliff, and then they'd say, and next week, be sure to be here for the continuing saga of, Thunderhead and his whatever. And certainly the newsreel was on. Had no idea how old the newsreel was, but we would watch the newsreel and then keep on going until the movie was over, until we got to the part where we came in, and then if it was really good, we might stay a little longer. If not, bang, out we'd go, and we'd run across the street to the Oak Theater. That was the newest one. That last one built, that, as I recall. It was on the corner of Logan and Main Street. Very narrow theater, not as big as the Regent, as I recall, and it had the very same thing, except the movies, of course, were different. And by that time, it was, maybe 2:30, and then we had to rush back across the street to the Colonial. That was I think it was right next to the Regent.
The day that it was increased to 10 cents, I couldn't get in because Mr. Miles was at the door, and I went home to tell my mother that the price went up to 10 cents. Well, my mother almost had a kitten. First of all, she didn't believe me. She thought I had lost the nickel, and she was ready to take it out on me. And I kept yelling, I have the nickel in my hand if you wanted to see it. She grabbed me, dragged me down to the Palace Theater, pushed me in to the theater, and told Mr. Miles in certain language that she was not told about the increase and refused to pay it, but she would give him the nickel for the day that I came, gave me a comic book, pushed me and told me to go upstairs and have a good time. I don't know what happened after that, but I went to the show. The next week, of course, it was 10 cents.
My memory is that I got a quarter, which got me in and got me popcorn. And in those days, they didn't have any of those machines, printed tickets or anything, just the like that big roll of tickets with the numbers. I'd like to go early. I liked to stay late. I used to pretend to my parents that I fell asleep and I had to stay for the beginning of the next show, and I always pushed the time envelope about how long I could stay.
So we had 2, 4, 6. We had 6 movies, 3 serials, and it was about a 9-hour day that we would put in on that Saturday. The last movie, starting at 3, lasted a couple of hours, I guess. It's 5. Got to play in the trees on the way home. Then we got home, supper time. Boy, what a day that was. That was Saturday.
At the turn of the 20th century, when it was a major North American transportation hub, Winnipeg was the 3rd largest city in Canada. It was also a major entertainment centre, one of the prime stops on the North American vaudeville circuit. So it's not surprising that the movies took hold here as quickly as they did in other major cities. First as special attractions at fairs, incorporated into live variety shows, and in storefront Nickelodeons. In the city archives, I found a letter to the council from the police chief giving audience statistics for 9 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, November 29, 1913. The total across the city was 13,500 just for that one time. Some theatres survived for decades. Others came and went quickly. This one, located on Osborne Street where the Masonic Memorial Temple now stands, was built sometime around 1911 or 12 and lasted until 1921 or so. This photo, given to me by Donna Fumerton, was taken sometime in the teens by her great-aunt. While the big downtown theatres were built in the 20s by large companies like Famous Players, many of the neighbourhood houses were family businesses. Rhoda Campbell's father, Irwin Triller, owned the Apollo in Transcona, while her uncle and grandfather owned several others. Muriel Chunke's family, living in St. James in the 30s, owned and ran the Princess Theatre in Morris, just south of the city. Sheila Streifler's uncle, Sam Rosenblatt, after some success with a rented theatre, built his own in the North End.
My uncle, in 1935, decided to build his own theater. And he built the Tower Theater on Mountain and McGregor with a partner. After 4 years, the partner decided to sell his share. And he sold it to Jake Miles, who owned many, many theaters in Winnipeg. After a short time, Mr. Miles made my uncle the supervisor of his chain of theaters, which was called Western Theaters.
My father owned and operated the Apollo Theater in Transcona. And then my uncle owned and operated the Dominion Theater on Portage and Main. And the Furby Theater on Furby, my uncle Misha at one time and my grandfather owned that. And of course the most important thing, I guess, was my grandfather, Moishe Triller, who had the first theater in Winnipeg on Selkirk Avenue and Main Street. And it was called the Queens.
My parents ran a theater in Morris, Manitoba, and I grew up in that theater. We lived in St. James at the time, and we drove out to Morris every Saturday, and for a period of time, we went Fridays and Saturdays. Didn't stay overnight because we had to get back. In the holidays, that was another exciting time for me because I went with my mother to do the booking. We went to 3 or 4 different film exchanges. And the booker, he had, I remember this big book, about yay wide and that high. And he'd flip through the pages. Oh yes, Mrs. Todd, he said, you can have that on such and such a date. Or my mother would say, no, that won't do. It has to be over here. And so I was right there watching, taking it all in, you know.
He would always take me with him to the film exchange. He'd go once a week over to get the film, and that used to be where the art gallery is now. I knew everybody at the film exchange, and I'd sit on the desk, and they all had suckers for me, and I would talk to all the fellows and everything. So that was fun. I got to know all of them. This must have been at the film exchange when they had the Mickey Mouse picture on the wall. My father took me, and there I am at 3 or 4 standing and very thrilled with Mickey Mouse. And the fellows would get the film and bring it out to the show, and he used to put the pictures up in front of the show of what was playing. They'd change them Monday and Wednesday.
They really didn't have too much of a social life because my uncle worked every night. I mean, his times were like from 5 o'clock till 10 at night as the supervisor. So their social life was kind of curtailed, you know, because of that.
They enjoyed it, and they had a life around it. They had friends that all owned theaters in Winnipeg, and they were all very friendly. And they had the motion picture picnic. I believe it was every spring, April or May, probably May. And there was a whole group of people that were all involved in this.
My father was a member of the Motion Picture Pioneers, Canadian Picture Pioneers, J.A. Todd, James Alexander, over a quarter century of service. And that was from 1949. And there's a picture of my father when he was at a Motion Picture Pioneers meeting. And this is my father here, James Alexander Todd. They say I look a lot like him. And who these gentlemen are, I have no idea. I wouldn't know. As an organization, the Pioneers, they got together, they had their meetings to discuss business and theaters in general, the movies. And then they had always a big banquet. And my mother and dad used to go, and sometimes I'd go to the banquet, and that was really nice.
There were very few neighbourhood theatres still operating when I arrived in the city in 1973. Most had closed in the mid to late 50s, unable to survive the arrival of television. 2 that held on that I occasionally went to were the King's in St. James and the Highland on North Main. The King's, which survived until the mid-90s, is now a skateboard shop. It had a reputation in the 60s for running big musicals like The Sound of Music and My Fair Lady for more than a year at a time. But my earliest memory of it is of Last Tango in Paris being seized by the police on opening day in 1973. I had to wait until the courts cleared the film before I could see it.
There was times when Mom and Dad figured I was better off to stay at home. So they would get my Grandma Delorme, this is my mother's mother, to come and stay with me. And I was about, 10, 11 maybe, something like that. And of course, busman's holiday, I wanted to go to a movie. And my grandma, she was a little short lady. She was only about 4.5 feet tall. And very cheerful and quite old at that time. And I said, Grandma, we go to a movie. Oh, yes, we go to a movie. So we went to the King's Theater, which was just a street over from where we lived. And the King's Theater was really a nice place to go. It was handy, and we went there quite often. So we went to see, and I'm a little fuzzy on this, but I think it was called The Return of the Zombies. My grandmother would sit through that horror picture, and we'd laugh, and we'd walk home and laugh about these zombies and try to walk like the zombies did. So, yeah, it was fun with Grandma, and we'd go home and have some hot chocolate.
The Highland, formerly the Deluxe on North Main and now a synagogue, Didn't last as long as the King's, closing in the early 80s. But I did go there occasionally in the late 70s for midnight horror double bills. I imagine that the party atmosphere at those shows was similar to an old-time kids' matinee.
It seemed that the mothers wanted to get rid of their kids on Saturday so they could have time off, so they sent them off. I mean, we went by ourselves. I must have been maybe 8 to 10 years old, and we walked to the movie theater, the Deluxe on Main Street, and it was just like a zoo in there. The kids were screaming and yelling, and there was a husband and wife, a Jewish couple that owned it, and they had this big opening into the movie theater, and when the theater was full, they stuck all the kids in front of this frame and gave us a ticket, and we had to wait till it was our turn. If somebody left the theater and we got our number called, we would go and take that place. So they played about 52 cartoons in an hour, and then came the movies. So there were kids coming and going, and it was like I'll always remember that, because the lady the lady that was running it, they couldn't afford to pay ushers or anything, so she was running the whole show. She was giving out the tickets, and then she'd go down the aisle with her flashlight, and she would go, "Children, quiet, children." And kids wouldn't listen. They're throwing popcorn around, and then my sister and I would hide upstairs after the kids' movies were over. We'd go upstairs where the projection room was, and we would wait until all the kids left, and then we'd sneak back into the theater and watch some more movies, which were for the adults. And so we would be there all day. I'd get home in the evenings, we'd be walking at night, and my mother never said anything. I think she was glad to get rid of us for a while. And we did this for I don't know how many years.
The big theatres like the Met, the Capitol, the Garrick, the Odeon, were elegant buildings in the tradition of legitimate theatre. The local houses were less ostentatious and more informal. By the early 60s, most had finally closed their doors permanently. But in earlier decades, it was here that kids who seldom travelled beyond their own neighbourhood discovered a form of entertainment that opened up whole other worlds of experience.
It was not uncommon for kids to go to movies by themselves. Either they'd be dropped off at the movie theater, or they'd get there on their own. So this is an adventure for kids. This is something else. We're talking Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, pushed up to the 1950s and 60s. It was great. Perhaps throughout the week, you may have had the opportunity to hop on a bus or be driven in your parents' car, and you're going past the theater, and you'd always be looking to see did they change the marquee? Did they change what's coming? Oh, it's finally here. Taking a look at the still shots and the posters, and you had to go. You had no option. I mean, it was just part of growing up, and so you'd make your way down to the Windsor, and inevitably there would be a long lineup. But if you got there early enough, you got a good position in line, and no cutting in line. That was the rule. But of course, the bigger guys, and their friends would cut in line. There wasn't too much you could do about it. But as you got closer and closer and closer to the door, you get more excited, and now you're up to the posters. See, underneath the marquee, they'd have these huge posters, plus some still shots of the movies that were up and coming, and the movie that was showing. There was, space movies, there was horror films, the Frankensteins, the Boris Karloffs and Vincent Price movies and everything else. I mean, we were all kids back there, and this was, how do you beat this? This was great.
I seem to recall going to the Windsor just once, when I saw MASH in second run in 1973. But that might be wrong, as one source says that by that time, it was showing nothing but adult movies.
First job I got was the Windsor Theater in St. Vital as a doorman. Almost like a one-man operation there. There was just the manager, the cashier, the candy girl, and the doorman and one usher, and the projectionist. And we ran the whole thing. We played all the, not first run, but close to it. And sometimes we played a lot of the risque movies, all kinds of movies that was frowned upon when you played it in the theaters.
The Windsor closed permanently in 1974, eventually becoming a chapel before being replaced by a meat market. The Gary on Pembina Highway at Point Road had closed 13 years earlier in 1961.
I was about 5 years old. There was a theater on Pembina Highway called the Gary, and I would go with my girlfriend and her brother and my little sister and go to the Saturday afternoon movies. And often we would first go to the Lions pool down the street, go swimming there for a while, and then make our way down to the theater in our wet bathing suits and pay your 15 cents, as I recall, and go in and sit for the whole afternoon, where you'd have a short and a cartoon and a feature-length movie, and you would never know what the movie was going to be, and I don't know how appropriate any of them were, but it was just pure entertainment. It was full of kids, full of popcorn and drinks and noise.
The Palace Theater was pretty noisy, okay? Because everybody liked to talk and nobody listened. I guess, as children, you do stupid things, and you don't think they are at the time you're doing it. The Palace Theater had a balcony, and if you got there early enough, you were on the edge of the balcony, so you could either drop paper or spit, and then you'd move back so they wouldn't figure out who it was. But those were stupid things that all kids do, I would assume. I know I did it.
I remember my sister and I, we were 10, I remember that age. We were 10 and we were in the Tower Theater and we were waiting in line. And we had rollers in our hair, those plastic things. My mother sent us there with rollers in her hair, don't ask me why. And we got into a fight. And we were on the floor and we were pulling at each other's hair and everybody surrounding us and cheering, and nobody broke it up. Like, there was nobody in the theater who cared. We finished arguing, we watched the movie. There were no ushers. It was only run by the people who owned it. But we had a good time. It was fun.
I was always been a dreamer, so I used to like to enjoy the fantasy movies with lots of action. So we'd look through the papers and see which theaters had John Wayne movies, for example, whether they were westerns or war movies. And you have to understand that in my neighborhood, the kids sort of use that as the escape from whatever might have been bugging us during the week at school. And for a few hours, we became John Wayne. And a lot of that carried over into the playtime that we had when we weren't at the movie theaters. My bicycle became John Wayne's Corsair, flying over the South Pacific in the Flying Leathernecks. So those kinds of things carried on for me in the intervening time between movies.
The people that ran it, they were an elderly couple. Mind you, when you're a young child or young kid, everyone's older. But I seem to recall that she had silvery gray hair and some round glasses. She wasn't all that tall, but what a presence she had. Now, I believe her name may have been Mrs. Johnson. Her and her husband, not only did they do the box office, they ran the projector, they ran the concession stand, selling the popcorn and the drinks. But Mrs. Johnson's was notorious because, see, you got to remember, we were an unruly bunch. We had a lot of ingenuity. Like, we discovered that the box of popcorn, because popcorn at that time came in boxes, these red boxes. You'd eat the popcorn, then you flatten the boxes, and what you had was the predecessor to the Frisbee. Now, if there was a particularly boring part in the movie, let's say there was a kissing part, Well, all the guys would just whip these things at the screen, and all of a sudden you'd hear Mrs. Johnson coming down the aisle. You know, you heard her because she had this wooden baton, which it may have been a ruler or something, and she'd go whack, whack. You kids be quiet, you know, or else I'm turning on the lights. And sure enough, you know, as soon as we flung those things, up would come the lights. What a memory. It was fabulous.
They used to show westerns, old westerns, Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy.
These were in black and white, of course, and they had the same stock footage, chase footage, film after film, but we didn't notice. Even for the time, these were old. These were largely made in the early 40s. The most common star was a guy named Johnny Mac Brown. But they also featured the Durango Kid, Lash LaRue, Whip Wilson, among others.
And I don't know where they got the policy that it still bothers me this day that you couldn't stay and see the first run movie. And they had good ones then, but you had to leave. I don't know, I understand that now, you know.
They would herd us out about 4:30. And some of us would approach the manager, Mr. Ostrander, and say, hey, Mr. Ostrander, you know, I think if we're quiet, we could stay for the feature presentation. And he'd say, you know, oh, I don't know, boys. But sometimes he'd let us stay. And we were hoping for a steamy melodrama, maybe with Gloria Graham in her slip, or Dan Duryea hitting the bottle.
When I think of it now, I mean, it almost sounds like child abuse. You're letting 5-year-olds taking their younger brothers and sisters and walking up to the highway. But even then, I mean, traffic wasn't the same, and I guess we didn't know about predators or anything like that. So it was, you know, again, such an innocent time. Bye, Mom, it's noon, you know, come back home at supper time. And yeah, it's what everybody did, so it wasn't really considered scary or risky at that time.
Although close to the heart of downtown, Main Street, just north of Portage, had a disreputable image as it pushed towards the poorer North End with its largely immigrant population. Just blocks away from the elegant first-run picture palaces, the Met, the Odeon, the Capitol, were more than half a dozen Main Street theatres, which were shunned by many from more affluent parts of the city.
As a 9-year-old kid, I assured my buddies that I would attend all 44 of the theaters in the city. The downtown theaters were simple, but then things got tough, really tough. Between Logan and Higgins on the west side of Maine, this was the era of the hard-drinking white man. There were drunks all over the streets, as people from that era will remember. And so I had to tiptoe around the drunks, went to the Starland and the Fox, which were marginal. The Regent was pretty scary. But by the time I hit the Colonial, later the State, between Henry and Higgins, it was just terrifying. It was just a hole in the wall. But the biggest challenge was the Oak. The Oak was so tough that it was reputed that you would get in for half price if you took your own apple box to sit on. So fully equipped, I jumped on the Crescent bus, arrived at the Oak. Admission was 20 cents. I added up a dime. The cashier said, that'll be another 10 cents, please. And I said, well, I've got my box. And there was a pregnant pause. Then I said, well, everybody knows that you get in for half price at the Oak if you bring your own apple box to sit on. The manager was summoned, and he assured me that this was not the policy of the Oak Theater.
It's where Mitchell Fabrics is now. That was called the Oak Theater, and there was a story, I don't know, urban myth. We didn't have that term then, but there was a story that when you went to the Oak, you had to bring your own apple box to sit on. And those are the days when apple boxes were wood. I did later in my life go to the Oak once just to see, to see if it really didn't have seats or something, but it had seats.
Inside, the Oak lived up to its reputation. The washroom did not have a door on it. The toilet did not have a seat on it and was completely black inside. And there was a crude sign saying, "Don't flush." So, of course, I flushed it immediately. And a waterfall ensued running across what passed for the lobby. So what could I do? I went to the manager and complained. The Oak Theater closed a couple of months later forever.
My husband grew up in North End, Winnipeg, and in the 1950s, they were living on Euclid. And every Saturday, he and his father would get all dressed up, his father in a suit and white shirt and tie, and they would walk down to Main Street, and they would catch the streetcar, and they would go down where they would have the choice of seeing the Starland, the Regent, or the Colonial. So they would walk up to each of these theaters where outside there would be one of those wooden display boards, and they would see what the matinee was going to be. They were newly come over from Europe, and my father-in-law's English still wasn't very good. He was Polish by birth, but that didn't matter. It was the whole experience of going to the movies on Saturday afternoon with his son. And so they would decide which theater they were going to attend based on these display boards. And they would go in, and it cost 15 cents to go to the show. And my husband said he remembers that some of the theaters, they had double curtains, so one velvet curtain would roll up, and the other set of velvet curtains would pull to the side. And once the show started again, my father-in-law, he was only developing his understanding of English, and so most of the show he didn't understand at all. And eventually then my husband would explain to my father-in-law what the movie was all about. And then during the intermission, girls would come down the aisle and you could buy snacks and candies. They had very little money at that time, so this was a huge expenditure. And my husband distinctly remembers having these wonderful ice cream bars out of these snack trays.
The Regent Theatre had been built as one of Canada's first movie houses in 1912, as the Rex, and renamed in 1923. By the time I went to it, just once in the late 70s, for the famous Saturday midnight Rocky Horror Picture Show event, it had been renamed again as the Epic. Like many old theatres, it stood empty for 2 decades before being demolished to make way for new development. Other theatres, although not demolished, were repurposed, turned into bars, supermarkets, and even bowling alleys. For years I've gone past the picturesque uptown bowling lanes on Academy Road, aware that this was once a movie theatre, and certainly the most architecturally distinctive neighbourhood house in the city. But I only found out recently what a special place it held in the history of moviegoing in Winnipeg. Gene Morton and Andrew Ostrander's father managed the theatre from 1945 to its conversion in 1960 to the still thriving bowling alley.
My mother and father met at the Uptown, and that would have been in 1945 or so.
She was a cashier. He hired her as a cashier, and that's how they met.
He managed other theaters before the Uptown, and he was managing the Uptown, I guess, before we were born. You know, River Heights was built as a organized neighborhood when it was built, and there were a lot of rules, and there was a covenant about what you could and couldn't have, and you could not have a theater on Academy Road or any businesses on Academy Road. And I understand there was quite a lot of civic controversy when the owners of the theater wanted to build it. Because there were also people known to the cashiers who got to come in free. These were the people who had been among the most strong opponents of building the theater there, and part of their, reward or payoff, whatever was to get free admission to the theater, so they would be let in for free. It was always magic for me when I would drive there with my father. We'd go down Academy Road and watch and watch, and in the distance, and suddenly this Moorish palace would appear. I didn't know the words for it then, but now I know that the Uptown Theater was built in the style of a Moorish palace. It's Moorish architecture on the exterior.
And I remember going there, and we had sort of the run of the place, and there were tunnels that you could go into towards the front of the theater, and you could go underneath the where the audience sat and come up at the back of the stage. I remember getting in trouble once because I popped up behind the stage and my shadow was showing.
The interior of the theater was even more magical, built as the interior of a Moorish courtyard. And it was fantastic. It had balconies on the left and the right as you faced the stage, held up by pillars with spiral fluting.
The most incredible feature of it was the ceiling, which was a black blue sky with winking stars, which rotated such that the moon rose and set, and then a white plane would fly over from time to time.
It was a beautiful theater because you could see the stars glistening in the ceiling. It was a high ceiling, very grandiose. Just like it was the Cadillac of theaters, just like the Lyceum was a Chevy, and the Uptown was a Cadillac.
A unique feature of the Uptown was the so-called sneak preview on Thursday nights, known simply as the Sneak to all the comfortable burghers of the area. Basically, it was a film that was coming to either the Capitol or the Met, and it was a secret. Now, this was the hottest ticket in town, and the crowd would be buzzing in anticipation as showtime approached. The movie critic of the time with the Free Press, a fellow named Frank Morris, would make a grand entrance, and some of the fathers would embarrass the hell out of us by approaching him and asking him to reveal the movie.
At one point, I was perhaps 12 years old or something, I was allowed to go to a sneak preview because my father knew what was coming on and he knew I would like it. But I got the big lecture before I went about how I had to be quiet and act grown up with the sneak preview. They were a big social occasion.
And they had the loge seats, which you would pay more for because it was quite a classy event to attend.
Unfortunately, I remember one Thursday night in 1957, that was a terrible experience because I saw Bernadine with Pat Boone. And we walked home, and then this is a vivid memory because actually when we got home, got a phone call from my grandmother who had a heart attack, and she died that night. So forevermore, that's locked in my mind, is seeing Bernadine with Pat Boone.
The number of theatres declined rapidly in the years after the introduction of television in the early 50s, but it wasn't only neighbourhood theatres which closed. Downtown also lost a number of movie houses in the late 50s and the early 60s. The Bijou and the Beacon on Main, the Dominion on Portage Avenue East. Two of the longest-running theatres, the Province, built in 1916 and renamed later as the Rio, and finally the Grand, and the Lyceum, built in 1912, had long since undergone a decline, ending their days as triple-bill grindhouses.
The Lyceum had horror movies a lot. The Blob and The Thing and The Tingler and The Pit and the Pendulum. I don't know why I remember those more than the other movies. I liked horror movies then. I don't anymore.
There was I think it was called The Tingler, and I can't remember, I think it was at the Lyceum Theater where it was shown, where whenever the creature was running rampant, they would send a minor electrical charge through the seating area, and you'd feel this tingling on your rear end and up your spine.
For 2 weeks, I was a doorman at the Lyceum Theater on Portage Avenue. It was during the flood. the 1950 flood. I had just left university and we were going to head out to Vancouver for a vacation, my chum and I and his parents in his little Austin, and he said, we need a doorman at the Lyceum Theater. Would you be interested? I said, sure. As it was the only theater left open during the flood because very few of the toilets were working on Portage Avenue or Main Street. Most businesses were closed and many were pumping water out onto the street. But the Lyceum still had the toilet working, and I believe Child's Restaurant still had the toilets working, and they were probably the only two places open. Anyway, the movie went on, but my job as the doorman, about once every hour, I would get a can of Flit, and I would walk down the aisle with some perfume stuff in us, spraying the theater, up one aisle and down another and up and down the aisle for about 5 minutes, just to make it a little sweeter smelling, because sewage doesn't smell good, especially when you're watching a movie sort of thing.
Many people recall that from the 30s through the 60s, neighborhood theaters, as hubs of community activity, offered more than just movies. There was interactive entertainment for the kids and promotional draws and bonuses for their parents.
They would bring us up on stage for birthday parties, and they'd have games like musical chairs and yo-yo contests.
Some stage of my life, it became my Saturday duty there to help my father, and I would go up as the first show was about to end, and I would participate in setting the stage up for the intermission contest. The projectionist would close the sheer curtains, and I think I pushed the button to bring the big stage curtains across, and then there were footlights, alternating blue, red, yellow, all across the front of the stage, and I would push the buttons in order, first the red, then the blue, then the yellow. I think that's what it was. And as a kid in the audience, it was magical. Again, it was just seeing these colored lights come up. You know, that was kind of a magic moment for me.
They would have a host on the stage. I remember I knew him. He's dead now. Freddie Glazerman. He was a character, and he would wear this little purple usher suit. And he was on the stage, and I remember once they gave, as a prize, they gave away one of Lassie, the real Lassie's pups. And this kid on our street named Dougie Robertson, he won, and he named the pup Chips. So Chips was Lassie's pup. And so, yeah, so that was pretty fun.
And I do remember the Rialto, they'd have an intermission, and you would have a portion of your ticket, and they would read off the numbers, and if it was the numbers, your ticket, you won a prize, and lo and behold, and I do remember this movie. It was a Sinbad the Sailor movie, and I was sitting there, and it was intermission time, and out came the manager, who was dressed more like a used car salesman than what you would imagine a manager would look like, and he drew my number. He called out my number, and my number won me this huge box of popcorn. I was ecstatic. Here I am, no money to get popcorn, and I have just won a large box of popcorn. And I remember running up onto the stage, and he looked at my ticket, gave me the box of popcorn, and I went back to my seat, and the movie started again, and I was sharing my popcorn with all of these kids around me that I didn't even know them. You know, I had no idea who these kids were, but we were all, it just seemed that we were all in the same boat. It's a really wonderful memory. It was a great thing, and as much as a large box of popcorn isn't much, but to me at that time it was a lot. It meant a lot.
If it happened to be your birthday, then you were invited to come up onto the stage, and there would be musical chairs, and then the last person left sitting would either get a small prize or your entrance for the movie that day was free.
Well, one of the problems with the kids' matinee birthday feature, they'd invite people up for having a birthday, but of course everybody was having a birthday that day, and it became chaos.
I went up on the stage because it was my birthday and I felt I had a right, and the contest was drinking Coca-Cola as fast as possible, and I really wanted to win because the prize was a white hamster, and I don't think my father wanted me in the contest at all, and I don't think he wanted me to win at all, but I drank that Coke the fastest, and to my mother's horror I brought home a white hamster.
When we got into the theater, most times it was dark, so I never really knew how much of a stage there was until this one theater, and I think it was the Regent. They would have, in the summer months, contests. Do you remember a thing called the yo-yo? Well, there were yo-yo contests put on by the Cheerio people. They would have some of their professionals come in and play this yo-yo. That's the little wooden cylinder with a string on it, and they would do all these tricks with these yo-yos. I remember a few of the names. There was Rock the Cradle, Walking the Dog, Around the World.
And the competitions were pretty keen. Every once in a while you might get lucky and you'd win a sweater, or you'd win a special yo-yo, and the same with a bolo bat.
That was the paddle with a long elastic on it and a rubber ball on it. I was pretty good at that, but there weren't as many tricks. The main thing there was to just keep the ball bouncing off of the bat, and he who lasted the longest was the winner, sort of thing. And those competitions also went on for a few weeks, as I remember. I think I was called back for a couple of weeks, and then I failed miserably. I looked out for admiring glances and I missed the ball, and I was out. However, that was another little bit of fun.
For adults, the attraction wasn't just fun. There was also profit. Giveaways gave patrons a reason to keep coming back week after week.
They had a piano player up front for the music, and at 9 o'clock everything stopped on a Saturday night and they would give out dishes or carnival glass. The idea of the dishes was if you came every week, you got a collection. So you were coming to get your whole collection. You had to get 12 dishes and then 12 cups and saucers in the different sizes. And of course they wanted to finish their set, so they would come every Saturday to get the next dishes. And I think they got 2 or 3 dishes every week of one sort, but there were so many different kinds of dishes.
The Beacon also had gift night. I think every Thursday night they gave away a dish, a cup, a saucer, a plate, whatever, of a whole set. And if you went 30 weeks out of the year, you had 30 pieces of flatware that your mother could use somewhere along the line. Well, I think my mother had most of that stuff that we collected back in the late 30s and the early 40s. I think she still had some of it in the mid-50s, maybe even in the 60s.
I don't remember the downtown theaters doing that. I remember it being more the family theaters, you know, the smaller ones. But the suburbs needed it more, it seems, the outside theaters.
The neighborhood houses attempted to stave off disaster by introducing a gimmick called photo night, in which attendees had their picture taken and were eligible for, yes, a weekly substantial cash prize.
Every Wednesday night, we'd walk across the Norwood Bridge to the Plaza Theater. And my parents, I think, wanted to go because it was called photo night, and there was a draw for money. That was always helpful. I think it was about $400, which at that time was a tremendous amount of money. It's the only time I remember my mom and dad and I going out any place together. There wasn't a lot of money, And we didn't have a car, nor did anybody else that I went to school with that I can remember.
I'm not a car owner, so I only rarely went to drive-ins. I think the last time was at the Odeon, just west of the city, where I saw Rambo: First Blood Part 2 in 1985. The Odeon held on longest of all the drive-ins, but it too finally closed in 2007 due to lack of business.
Oh, drive-ins, oh yes. I'd actually forgotten about those. We went in high school a little bit. And then when I was first married and I had 2 young children, there was the whole station wagon thing, and my husband and I went to drive-ins, and the kids would fall asleep in the back and so on. Yeah, the North Main drive-in particularly, because we're both from the North End.
My parents would put pillows in the back seat and we'd be in our pajamas in the car. And that way, I guess, once we got home, we were ready for bed because it was very, very late. Of course, we'd be sleeping in the car on the way. In fact, we were 5 kids, so my parents would put a bench in the back seat. There was no seat belts or safety problems, right? So they put a bench on the back seat, so it was just one big bed. So you just kind of roll around on there and look at the movies.
I remember being in a sandbox at the front and Swings and Play Center at the front of all the drive-ins in front of the screen. So as parents, you could come and sit in the car, and the little kids would go up and play in the sandbox or play in the play area until the movie started.
I guess I can remember actually when I was young going to the drive-in with my girlfriend and her parents, and this was the time when the Beatles had just put out their movie. So Hard Day's Night, I think, was the first movie, and so we were probably around 9 or 10 years old. And we had seen on TV how girls were reacting to the Beatles, and of course, it was just pandemonium where they were just screaming. You couldn't hear the music, and they were teenagers, and we were 9 or 10 years old, and of course, emulating those teenagers. So the movie starts, and we, on cue, my girlfriend and I, start screaming from the back seat. Well, her parents were having none of that. They were just terrified that we started screaming as if someone had entered the back seat or something. So we were quickly shushed and realized that, no, you don't actually do it in the car. It was something of a theater experience.
For the long weekends in the summertime, the drive-ins would do 4 movies, and that would take you from sunset to sunup. And if you wanted to get into those all-nighters, you needed to be there very early. So I can remember the drive-in on Regent lining up to get into that theater for hours. And to pass the time, guys would pass the football around and you'd play catch and everything, but you'd be there for hours waiting to get into these all-nighters. And after basically 8 hours of movie going, the sun was coming up and you were heading home, if you made it through all 4 of them.
So it would start at about 10 o'clock and it would run 4 movies, so you wouldn't get home until 5 in the morning. So there was just a big draw to being able to stay out all night, of course.
Sometimes when I worked at the drive-in later on, they had 5 movies. All-nighter was 5 movies. Those movies were like 8 hours long. There's no way it's 8 hours dark enough. So by the time it's 5 o'clock in the morning, people are still sitting there. There's still an hour of movie to go. And there's no picture going to the screen anymore because there's too much light. I just turned the power off. There's no light trying to send the picture out. And the people got upset. And they would come in and say, I can't see the picture. I says, the sun is shining above the screen. You're not going to see the picture. But I can hear it, but I can't see it. Well, you're not going to see it.
I had a strange experience with the drive-in. I remember when the movie True Grit was playing at the drive-in. I believe it was at the Airliner drive-in. It was the middle of winter, January, February. It must have been minus 30 something. And I'm with a bunch of my buddies, and we're in the car, fogged up windows and all, and a speaker that barely worked half the time. But I happened to look over the next car, and there was some guy sitting on the hood of his car, leaned up against, in a T-shirt, watching the movie. I don't remember the movie as much as I remember seeing this fellow. Why would he be doing that?
The last time I went to a drive-in, I was still expecting to take that speaker and put it on my window. And somebody pointed out, well, no, just tune your radio to the FM station. And it's like, what? That drew us back to drive-ins. And then we realized on a nice evening, we would actually take a large ghetto blaster, we would put it in front of our vehicle and tune it to the radio station. And it was just like being at a movie theater. You had the speakers right in front of you, you were enjoying the skylight, the starlight and everything. And now they're all gone.
No, I somehow didn't go to drive-ins. I think I was shy back then. I think basically drive-ins for more or less for having sex in the car. So I don't remember. I was too shy to have sex in a car, I think. So I probably didn't go to drive-in. You know, I actually wanted to watch the movies.
The Metropolitan Theater, built as the Allen on Donald Street in 1921, was one of the best loved and most elegant in Winnipeg. After it closed in 1987, there were many efforts to save the building, but it stood empty for 2 decades before Canad Inns began to restore it a couple of years ago. I can remember sitting at the far back of the balcony to watch Quest for Fire and almost getting vertigo from the altitude.
As a teenager, I worked part-time as an usher at the Metropolitan Theater on Donald Street across from Eaton's department store. My job was to try and, I don't know, help the crowds into their seats, and theaters were typically crowded. Anyway, because I was ushering a movie theater, I saw movies that I probably wouldn't have been able to get into. I don't know, I had the guilty pleasure of combining work and film viewing. I saw some wonderful things. I worked there for Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, A Streetcar Named Desire, an adult film being viewed by this innocent kid.
Most of my movie fare was westerns or war movies. And then when the B-grade Japanese science fiction / horror events came along, that took up a lot of our time as well. Things like Godzilla and Rodan the Flying Monster and Varan the Unbelievable. And yes, you could see the funny stop motion animation and the guy in the rubber suit and the whole thing, but just kind of a lot of fun. The Vincent Price kinds of things were another story. Those were a little straighter, and I can remember going to the Metropolitan to see the original version of The Fly with Vincent Price, and kind of ducking down behind the seat in front of me when the man with the fly head had the bag ripped off his head, because I dreaded the thing that was coming, and yet so you want to keep one eye over top of the thing so you don't miss it. But you really didn't want to see it with that kind of mixed reaction.
The closest thing to a palace that I was ever in, downstairs was kind of strictly business, but once you rose one of the 2 staircases, got to the 2nd floor, it was all red damask wall covering and ornate plasterwork, and looked like something out of the movies, and was meant to.
It was a gorgeous theater. And on the 2nd floor, on the mezzanine floor, they had a woman's washroom, which was like something out of a Hollywood movie set, with the mirrors and the little stools and soft lighting and tissues. And it was quite a miraculous place.
Some movies didn't really have my attention that much, and I would start to explore. And one day while I was in the Metropolitan, I was seated up in the balcony, and I decided that I would go exploring like a lot of young children would do. And I found a door at the back of the balcony. And to me, this was a mystical thing. And I opened the door, and I went in, and there was a staircase. Well, needless to say, I had to go and explore and find out exactly where it went to, and down the stairs I went, and lo and behold, when you entered the Metropolitan, there was a huge marquee, and that's where they would post the movies that were coming, up and coming. And it was actually a door, and this was a fire escape. So as I got to the bottom, I pushed on the door, and it opened, and I was on the main floor by the concession stand. The manager wasn't very impressed with me, and I did get a lecture and had to leave the theater, but it's just one of those wonderful moments that you'll cherish forever.
I remember that one New Year's Eve special attraction at the Metropolitan was a showing of An American in Paris, the spectacular MGM musical film that won a Special Academy Award, I think in perhaps 1951, at which time I would have been 16, possibly. Nothing would have prepared me for it, absolutely nothing. I'd never seen dance. I don't think I'd heard orchestral music, except occasionally on the little radio from New York. And then we had this wonderful score, and the American in Paris ballet with lights replacing water in those fountains in the Place de la Concorde. Wonderful movie altogether. I'll never forget the close-up of the rose that closes the ballet sequence. And the rose gets closer and closer to the camera lens, shimmering and amazingly beautiful. And when I think that I was on the verge of going into Fine Arts at the University of Manitoba, without really art education, I can realize how important being steeped, and that's what happened on the job, being steeped in a film like An American in Paris did for me what an art education might do for other people in a school or private lessons at an artist's home or whatever. I was getting a grounding in the dramatic arts, in the visual arts, in the musical arts even, all at once.
Of all the theatres which have disappeared, the one I personally miss the most is the magnificent 2,000-seat Capitol, which was located on Donald Street from 1921 until it was demolished in March of 2001. But by then, it had been left empty and rotting since 1990.
I grew up in Winnipeg. I came here when I was 8 years old because my dad was transferred here from the Capitol Theater in Regina to the Capitol Theater in Winnipeg. He was the manager there. I remember going to the theater with my mom and my little sister and brother to visit my dad at work, and I have these really good memories of going into the theater with this beautiful colored red carpet. I can't remember the pattern, but I just remember it was red and patterned, and it was really exciting because we would head to his office, which had manager on the door and his name, and we'd go inside and he'd be sitting behind this big wooden desk. I remember the wood was really shiny and dark, and we'd be playing around in there like kids do, and it was just, I felt really special being there because my dad was the manager.
No question about it. My favorite theater was the Capitol Theater, maybe because it was the first theater that I had gone to on my own, but I think more because of its beauty. I used to just love that domed ceiling. That was really pretty incredible.
I didn't know until recently that the Capitol, although located on Donald Street, originally had an entrance on Portage Avenue. Patrons, after buying their tickets, had to climb stairs in order to cross the back alley and entered the theater on the balcony level.
So I applied and trained to become a licensed projectionist for the theaters in Winnipeg. And in '74, I went over to the Capitol Theater, and I was training as a projectionist there, and the manager of the theater needed an assistant. And I worked there from '74 to '76 as an assistant manager and training as a projectionist. That's when they had crowds. And when they're playing certain movies, really blockbuster like Grease, we played the movie, and the lineups was from the Capitol Theater doors all the way around down Ellis, and it met with the Garrick Theater lineup. That's how long the people were lined up and waiting to come for the next show.
I can remember lining up for over an hour on a freezing winter Friday to get into the first matinee showing of The Exorcist. I might even be somewhere in this photo. All around me, people were psyching themselves up to be terrified. Personally, I found myself laughing all through the movie.
The Exorcist played there for about 4 months. And during that 4 months, every weekend it was sold out. 1,500 seats, 3 times a day, sold out, in and out. It was fantastic. And we were warned. The film company said some of the people in Toronto and that, they were passing out. They were fainting or they were throwing up on the aisles because when they got to the scene where the blood shoots up to the ceiling. So we were all prepared and we all had smelling salts. So we just took it for granted. Maybe they will faint. So the ushers were all at each aisle, and when that scene came on, we'd make sure we'd be watching. Sure enough, there's always people that they'd get up and they'd start walking, waving to the back, and then and some of them would faint. They just pass right out in the middle, and it's like people, like I saw one guy who must have been like 6'2", and he just boom fell on the. You have to go to a smelling salt, wake him up, and bring him out to the lobby.
I remember one time going to see a certain movie there. It was called Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn, and that was kind of a scary movie. When I think back on it now, I think, was I too young to be watching that movie at the time that it was out? I think I would have been around 10, maybe.
And that was a really big hit. That was playing here like 8 weeks, which is considered a long time. For the longest time, that was the greatest film I saw. Holy cow. That was an experience. Because with Wait Until Dark, in the last 8 minutes of the movie, they didn't let anybody into the theater, and all the lights suddenly went out except the exit signs. That was it. And you're not really aware of how much lighting there is in a theater while you're watching, but there's these little accent lights and lights to make you be able to see your way to your seat, or at least down the aisle and that. But all those lights went out, and the reason the lights went out was Audrey Hepburn was playing this blind woman who was being terrorized by Alan Arkin, who was out to murder her because she had this doll that she didn't know had tons of heroin embedded inside it. So what she does is she smashes all the lights in the place. So she's got the advantage on this because she knows her way around in the dark. He does not. And so as soon as she smashes the lights, then all the lights in the theater go out.
And everything was dark, and I remember screaming and hiding under the seats and everything.
And I tell you, it just sent chills through you, and quite the experience. Even watching it on video now, I recall that feeling.
In 1979, as a harbinger of changes to come in movie exhibition, famous players closed the Capitol for a couple of months in order to transform the balcony into a small second theater.
I was just finished high school and I was working as an iron worker for a company by the name of Abesco Steel. And the contract which they got was to go and convert the Capitol into Capitol 1 and Capitol 2.
I do remember that happening, but it was kind of that time, wasn't it? Like, was it the late 70s, I believe? And it was, everything was they were trying to move away from all the good old things to these, kind of cheap new things.
There was a big flatbed trailer that came to the back of the Capitol, and they had to go and bring in one truss at a time and put one at one end, lift it up. We had come-alongs that were tied right to the original structure from the ceiling, which were huge wooden beams, and we had to lift it up little by little until it was in position, and then we bolted it to the column that was on the side, and the come-along held that truss on one side until we went and we got the truss on the other side up. Same thing in position. We had these two trusses, which were huge steel structures. I'm not sure how much they weighed a piece, but they were tons of steel.
What they did is they built, from where the balcony ended, they built a floor, like just steel girders, a floor all the way to the front. Now the screen upstairs was a lot smaller screen, and it was projected from the projection booth that was already originally up there. Then they built another projection booth on the main floor. They took about maybe 10 rows of seats, about 40 feet wide, and then they built 2 projectors and a projection booth there for the main floor one. It looked terrible.
The space then between the screen and the seats was this white foam layer. A friend of mine said it looked like a disco floor. To me, I felt like I was on the moon because there was this big white in front of us and this dome that's almost on my head. The screen became really, really small, so when we saw Apocalypse Now there, it became Apocalypse New. And that was about it because the rest was cut off.
Felt kind of sacrilege going and doing this to this building, but it was a job. So we did it, it was completed, and it was the beginning of what I guess one might call a multiplex, a small one, if that. 2 theaters, which were, originally 1.
When they demolished it, I was in a parking lot, and as it happened, I just looked through the parking lot, and they were demolishing the Capitol Theater, and I was able to see right into the theater, right where the screen was. And that was a really special moment for me, because to me it was like saying goodbye to that theater. And I'm really glad I was there at that moment, because that place was very special. I have dear memories.
Nostalgia is often seen as an indulgence, a pointless clinging to the past. But is there really anything wrong with having fond memories of an experience that brought as much pleasure as going to the movies in a simpler media age, before multiplexes and home video and internet streaming? The last thing I asked each person I spoke to was, what do you miss most about the movie theatres that have disappeared?
I think I miss the fact that I could walk to a movie theater within an easy distance of my home. That, I think, particularly. So I miss the neighborhoodness of it.
The freedom of that experience. It was an unfettered social event, I guess. We just could go as a group of kids and go down to the movie theater and spend the little bit of allowance that we had on some, in some cases, very inane enjoyment.
The lights were certainly part of it, the glamour of the buildings, the sense of occasion, sitting in the dark and not going to sleep, I'll say.
I miss the curtains. It was just a slight touch, but it looked a little bit more elegant, as opposed to walking into a theater and you see this white space right in front of you, this white screen staring at you. Here it's covered, and now you're watching it like it's a play, like it is something very special. And yes, I miss the curtains most of all.
Maybe some of those times where we had the whole afternoon matinee kind of experience, whereas now it's just sort of sterile. You line up and you just go and sit. No one chats with anyone else or anything. You're just with your people that you're with. Maybe it's that it was that kind of an experience.
Well, it had a mystique because it was the only game in town. I mean, there was no television, so going to a movie was really something. You not only got a movie in those days, but you got probably a couple of cartoons, the news, maybe a short or a travelogue. And when you're young, this stuff was magical.
The character that each movie house had, I think that's what I miss. Because sometimes not only would you pick the right movie, but it would depend where it was playing. Because these places were grand. You felt important, I loved it,
Well, I would say my dad. When I think about old theaters, I think about my dad, and he's been gone for 22 or 23 years now, and It was such a big part of his life.
Back then, everything was all individual, and it meant something. You know, you made a conscious decision. I love this movie, and that was magic. It was rare, because it was going to leave forever, or you thought, until, of course, later on with DVDs and all that. But you didn't know that back then. So, because it was rare, you said, I have to see it. And then if you saw it once and you liked it, you'd say, oh God, I'll never see it again. So then you'd want to go 2-3 times to the same movie, and you'd pay each time. And I think that's missing from now, because it's so available.
It was great all the way around, especially, like I told you, at 5 cents, how can you miss, you know? Reality wasn't quite as tough as they make it today. I mean, you know, to hear the way they speak and what they do, I don't know if I could have taken it as a kid, but now it's an everyday thing. The kids coming out of grade 2 know the same words that I do. So it's a change, but I enjoy the movies.
It's a Saturday, time to make your way. Grab your friends and go to the local picture show. Get in line for the Saturday matinee. Riding rocket ships, interstellar trips. Cowboys sing a song, Dale and Trigger ride along. 10 cartoons at the Saturday matinee. Reality fades for the price of a dime. Oh, take me back just for a while to simpler times. Reality fades for the price of a dime. Well, take me back just for a while to simpler times.